Hello and welcome to the Living Hope program today. And today is a particularly special program because I want to concentrate on a subject which is very relevant and a subject which I know will touch the hearts of all who listen. One of the things that the scriptures tell us is that precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. And you can find that in Psalm 116, and it's in verse 16 too, it's 15. So Psalm 116 and verse 15. And we have here simply the verse, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Now, it's a very touching verse because we know that every day people pass away. That's not unusual, that's part of life. And even since I began this little program, already there will be people who have passed away. It's just the nature of things. That's not being morbid or miserable. Of course, it's also true that people are being born. But what is so special about this verse is the clear indication that everyone who passes from this life to the next, who loves and honours Jesus, they are precious to him. Now, just recently, we lost a very good friend. In the ministry of Living Hope, there have been people who've been quite strategic. There's been lots of people who've been a real blessing, and many churches who've been a real blessing. But there have been churches, there have been people who have been a particular significant blessing in the life of Living Hope. And one of the things about the churches that one works with is building up a relationship. I first went to Bilderston Baptist Church, it must be over 30 years ago. There was a couple who were living in the village, which Elaine and I were pastoring a little chapel in, and they wanted to get married. And the girl actually lived quite near Bilderston. And so that would be their home in a period of time. They got married in the south of England, and having lived together, started a teaching career, the door opened for them to move to Suffolk and to move to the church at Bilderston. And one day, the man, Steve, he said to me, I'd like to talk to our pastor because I think it would be good if you could come and preach in the church. And so he approached the pastor, a man called Brian Land, and it was great that we were able to get to know one another. In fact, the previous pastor, Peter, he was the one who I began fellowshipping with, and that introduced me to Brian, who brought about a stronger relationship because Brian took over from Peter. Sorry about all this history, but it is getting to the point. And the point is that church has stood with us in Living Hope for many, many years. Now, as I share this message with you today, there are many, many other churches. There are now 30 different churches that we fellowship with, but Bilderston was certainly one of the early ones that began to take on the vision of Living Hope. And in actual fact, I remember Brian wrote to me when he heard that I'd been made redundant from a certain ministry, and he wrote to me and he said, I want you to know God has not made you redundant. You're not redundant in terms of God. Men may have made their financial decisions, but you have not been made redundant by God. And those words really touched my heart. And I found myself in '94 on an aeroplane off to Kenya and off to Nairobi. And as I made that journey, some of you know that I was able to go on a flight deck of the plane, something that would never be allowed today. But I was able to go on the flight, and that opened up a door where an air stewardess came to me as the flight was coming to land and said, "Look, I gather you're a pastor from England. Please come and preach in my church." Well, Steve had invited me to preach in Bilderston, which was a thriving church in those days, and it was a great privilege to go. But this was going to open up another opportunity with a much bigger congregation. But when the air stewardess said, "I gather you're a pastor," I was aware that in the sight of God, I was still a minister of the gospel, regardless of the arrangements of others. And so we arrived, and God opened the door, and we had a wonderful time. God started to open many opportunities to preach and share the good news of Christ. And I came back having had a real sense that God was saying, "I'm going to do a new thing." And I believed that God would do it, but I had no idea what he meant by the new thing, but simply to trust him. And the new thing initially was working in Africa and getting to know pastors who were very much in need of support and encouragement and teaching. Some of the established denominations in Kenya have very good Bible schools. But many of the churches, particularly in the rural areas and in some of the, they call it slum areas, there was no way that any of them would ever afford to go anywhere to train. And so Living Hope began to emerge and develop and grow, teaching pastors, gathering pastors for seminars, and encouraging them to grow in their faith and the knowledge of the Word. Now, one of the churches that I then began to work with was a church in London, pastored by a dear brother called Sam Larby. And that church, again, they began to support Living Hope. And one of the things I very much enjoyed was attending, when I could, their prayer meeting. Now, London was some distance from where Elaine and I live on the south coast, but it was really good to be able to share in their prayer time. One of the things I found particularly gripping about their prayer times was the way in which we were able to just tenaciously pray through something to some sort of a conclusion. It wasn't just God bless this and then move on to the next subject. It was much more detailed than that, like a dog chewing a bone. And in one of these meetings, Reverend Sam began to bring words of prophecy over people, and people came, and he was waiting on God, and God gave him something for them. And as I was there, he summoned me to come forward for prayer. And I was getting used to this. I wasn't very used to it, but it was not a totally foreign thing to be in a situation of someone wanting to pray over you. And anyway, as he prayed over me, I remember that he said, God is going to bless Living Hope with some resources, and you can look forward to that. And he said, and God is going to open the door to Eastern Europe. Well, within a few days, a fairly sizable sum of money was given to Living Hope. an unusual size. It's not that we receive these sort of gifts every day, every week. And I began to think, well, if God had done that, then maybe indeed God was going to say something about Eastern Europe. But I thought, I don't know, how's that going to happen? But I've learned that if God says something, you can just relax. You don't have to make it happen. God will make it happen. Within a week or two of that meeting, I actually came to Bilderston Baptist Church. It was on my itinerary of churches to preach at. And so I turned up and preached, had a good time. And at the end of the meeting, a little lady came forward and she gave me an envelope. And I had no idea what was in it, but Chris Fox gave me the envelope, and she said, "This is just something for you to read and to think about." Well, when I got home, I opened the envelope and found it was all about EPIC, European Partners in Christ. And this was her ministry. And as I say, we're talking about sort of 29, 30 years ago nearly. And it was just so special because when I opened that envelope, I knew a few European missions. In fact, there was one relatively near to where we live on the south coast. But somehow, I just needed to have that sense this was God. And as I read Chris's literature, I just felt in my spirit, this is the door. This is how God's going to introduce me to things in Eastern Europe. And so Chris and I began to fellowship and to talk, and she began to think about places where I could use my Bible teaching gift. And so a number of places went through her mind, and the door opened indeed. And even to this day, when I had some very special friends that Chris introduced me to, there were a number, but some friends opened the door to other friends, and it just grew and grew. And so one will always be grateful for the link with Sam's Church in London, with the Bilderston Baptist Church in Suffolk, and very much Chris. Well, I don't know if I said this earlier, but Chris passed away just a little while ago. And so as I'm making this message, it will be available for all the churches I work with. But of course, it's interesting that I still have that link with Bilderston. And here's the verse that I mentioned at the beginning. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants or saints. I think that every life is precious to God. Every contribution means much to him.